What was the impact of the slave trade on agriculture and the economy of Africa? By Adam, Macy, Caitlin, and Grace. The African economy and staple crops. Maize and cassava were originally introduced into the African economy and diet during the Columbian Exchange. These crops were advantageous because they make different demands of soils, weather, and cultivation than Old World crops, and are different in the growing seasons in which they make these demands. In many cases, the American crops did not compete with Old World crops, but instead complemented them. For these reasons, both crops were quickly adopted as staples. Although maize was immediately adopted as a staple, its use grew even more during the transatlantic slave trade. Maize had already become indispensable to the African agricultural systems that were widely being reorganized along the Atlantic coast to meet the slave traders' growing demand for food. Maize provided a high-yielding, quick-maturing cereal that was easily prepared and whose grains could be stored for long periods. Despite their use in such a deplorable time in human history, maize and cassava became such an important part of African agriculture that they are still important staples for the continent today. Maize enabled more intensive use to be made of fertile, well-watered land, and cassava brought hitherto unproductive regions into use. This is one of the most important impacts of the slave trade on African agriculture. Jesuit slaveholders in Angola. One particular dynamic of how the slave trade influenced the economy and agricultural practices on the African continent comes from an unusual source: Jesuit priests. With the influx of European slave traders to the western coast of Africa, a shift in the economic sector of the region occurred, and a higher production of bodies were being moved through the area in order to make sales between African raiders and European traders. This economic transference influenced other areas of the economy to grow, particularly an increase in the growth of foodstuffs to be sold to European slave traders, exploiting those remaining on the African continent. The annual trade in foodstuffs involved thousands of tons of African-grown provisions. Slave ship captains produced food along the Guinea coast in various ways, from stocks held by forts operating under the same national flag, from resident European or Euro-African traders affiliated with these outposts, and directly from African and Euro-African merchants in areas of reliable supplies. One group that took advantage of this economic differentiation was the Jesuit order, a Roman Catholic brotherhood in Angola. The Jesuit order was likely the largest holder of slaves in the 17th century Portuguese Angola, which by 1658 held 10,000 slaves on 50 plantations. In Luanda, these food farms extended 30 miles inland and supplied both town residents and slave ship captains with provisions. This exploitation reveals a less prominent, or at least less talked about, perspective of how slavery played a role in shifting dynamics on the economy and agricultural labor usage on the African continent. Social costs on the African economy. The slave trade had a huge impact on the economy of Africa. When most people talk and think about the impacts of the slave trade on Africa, they gravitate toward the fact that there was so much depopulation that it made development difficult. There was a lot of depopulation, this is true, but the impact on Africa was on a much deeper level than just lack of development. A social death was created by the production of slaves that affected the entire society. It is a violent process where a person is brought to the brink of death, spared, and then ritualistically put to social death, left to owe the remainder of his life to another person. This is a cruel thing to do to the people around you, even if they were from a rival tribe. Many people in African society during the slave trade were taken advantage of and subjected to this kind of treatment. This process was a hindrance to social life and production. While people were busy rounding up slaves, they were less focused on the development of their societies. Agriculture would also take a hit during the slave trade because Africa was an agricultural society. As people were shipped off to the New World or to Europe during the slave trade, there would be less people to contribute to the development of agriculture in Africa. Trade in Africa created a system where some people were higher than others in the system. Some hierarchical systems evolved, for instance, from the willing tendency of new immigrants to adopt positions of subservience to groups that had initially settled in an area. The slave trade that evolved from this cruel system of trade included an even more drastic form of hierarchy, which included slaves and masters. In these situations, there were people who moved, but not of their own free will. Slavery as an integral part of Slavery as an integral part of the African economy. During the transatlantic slave trade, increases in the international demand for enslaved Africans induced a During the transatlantic slave trade, increases in the international demand for enslaved Africans induced a reallocation of resources in Africa towards slave production and away from other economic pursuits. This reallocation took from African societies what they could have been and stimulated the emergence of a system of slavery that was basic to the political economy of many parts of the continent, meaning that instead of peoples and nations focusing their time, energy, and resources on economic ventures like agriculture, infrastructure, or mining the continent's abundant natural resources, they allocated virtually all they had to the capture and sale of their own neighbors. The amount of wealth gained by prominent African middlemen was so great, and became such an important part of the lifestyle, that domestic slavery continued even after international abolishment. Slave raiding, or the attack of villages or communities by raiders who abducted most of the able-bodied young men present, became a common occurrence in Africa by the height of the slave trade. These raids usually resulted in wars and also contributed to the exacerbation of social and ethnic fragmentation, political instability, and weakening of states, and the corruption of judicial institutions. Essentially, the slave trade was and is part of, in some regions, the economy for the vast majority of African nations.